Have you ever cancelled plans and felt, underneath the guilt and the mild social anxiety about what others might think, a very quiet and very genuine sense of relief? Not the relief of escaping something unpleasant. Something deeper than that, something closer to the feeling of having been allowed, finally, to return to yourself, of having been given permission, by circumstance rather than by choice, to simply stop performing and simply be. Most people who feel this do not talk about it openly, because the world we live in has a very clear story about what it means to stay home. It means you are tired, it means you are struggling, it means you are missing out, falling behind, withdrawing from the life that is happening elsewhere, the life that is being photographed and shared and celebrated by everyone who chose to go out rather than to stay in. The world has made staying home into something that requires explanation, justification, or at minimum a believable excuse. Carl Jung would have recognized this cultural pressure immediately. And he would have said something very specific about it. He would have said that the discomfort you feel when you choose to stay home, the guilt and the self-questioning and the nagging sense that you should be somewhere else, is not a sign that staying home is wrong. It is a sign that the collective has become so dominant, so pervasive in its demands on the individual's time and attention and presence, that the most natural and most necessary human activity, the return to one's own inner life, has been made to feel like a failure, spent decades studying what happens to a human being when the inner life is consistently neglected in favor of external engagement, when every hour is filled with activity and interaction and performance and response, when the self is never given the quiet and the space it needs to process what has happened, to integrate what has been experienced, to hear its own voice beneath the noise of everything the world is constantly saying. What he found was not merely fatigue or mild discomfort. What he found was a particular form of psychological crisis that he described as the alienation from the self, the experience of living increasingly far from your own center while the surface of life continues to look perfectly adequate. This video is not an argument for isolation. It is not a defense of avoidance or a justification for withdrawing from life's genuine demands. It is something more specific and more necessary than that. It is an invitation to understand, through the lens of Carl Jung's depth psychology, why the act of staying home, of choosing stillness over stimulation, of returning to your own interior rather than constantly extending yourself outward into the world, may be not a retreat from living but the most essential thing you can do for the quality of the life you are living. Number 1, the house as a symbol of the psyche. Jung was a man who took symbols seriously, not as decorations or metaphors to be used and discarded, but as living carriers of psychological meaning, as the language through which the unconscious communicates what the conscious mind cannot yet articulate directly. And one of the symbols he returned to most consistently, in his writing, in his clinical work, and in his own life, was the house. In Jung's understanding, the house is not merely a building. It is one of the oldest and most universal symbols for the structure of the psyche itself. When people dream of houses, as people have dreamed of houses throughout recorded history, and across every culture that left records of its inner life, they are dreaming about themselves, about the structure of their own psychological being. The foundation of the house is the deepest layer of the psyche, the unconscious inheritance, the ancestral substrate that supports everything built upon it. The rooms are the various aspects of the self, some familiar and well-lit, some unexplored, some deliberately kept closed. The attic holds what has been stored and half forgotten. The basement holds what has been suppressed. The windows are the ways of looking outward at the world. The doors are the choices about what to let in and what to keep out. Jung himself built a literal house. The tower at Bollingen on the shore of Lake Zurich, which he constructed with his own hands, and which he continued to add to and modify over the decades of his later life. He described this building as the concretization of his psyche, a physical act of individuation, the making real in stone and wood of what was happening in the inner life. He wrote about the Bollingen Tower as the place where he could hear himself most clearly, where the noise of the professional world and the social world and the world of collective demands fell away, and what remained was the essential, the real, the most genuinely his own. This is what the home can be for those who are willing to let it be this. Not merely a shelter from weather, and a place to store possessions, but the physical space that corresponds to the inner space where the self actually lives. The place where, if you are willing to be quiet enough and honest enough, you can hear the voice of your own psyche speaking. Without the constant overlay of the world's demands and the world's noise, the act of staying home, understood this way, is not a small thing. It is not merely a preference or a lifestyle choice. It is the act of choosing to enter that inner space consciously, of deciding to spend time in the house of the psyche, rather than continuously rushing outward from it into a world that will always offer more stimulation, more distraction, more activity, more reasons to be somewhere other than where you actually are. Jung believed that the person who never spends time in their own inner house, who is always running outward in search of what the exterior world can offer, is not actually living more fully than the person who stays home. They are living more loudly, more visibly, more in the way that the collective understands and rewards. But they are not, in the deeper sense that Jung cared about, living more. They are, in fact, living less, because the dimension of life that is most genuinely theirs, the interior dimension, the one where the self actually forms and grows and becomes what it is capable of becoming, is being systematically starved of the attention it needs. Number 2. What happens to the psyche in constant outward movement? There is a particular quality of exhaustion that comes from a life of constant outward engagement that is different from physical tiredness. You can sleep for 8 hours and wake from it still carrying this exhaustion. You can take a vacation that fills every day with activity and return from it needing another vacation. You can spend an evening surrounded by people whose company you genuinely enjoy and arrive home feeling emptier than when you left. This is not a medical problem. It is a psychological one. It is the exhaustion of a psyche that has been extended outward for so long, with so little return to its own center, that it has begun to lose the thread of itself. Jung described the psychological life as requiring a fundamental rhythm, a movement outward into the world and a movement inward toward the self, engagement and withdrawal, expression and reception, the giving of oneself to external demands and the recovery of oneself in interior space. When this rhythm is functioning, life has a quality of sustainability. The outward engagement is nourished by the inward return. The capacity to be present to others is renewed by the time spent being present to oneself. The energy given to the world's demands is replenished in the silence of one's own company. When the rhythm is broken, when the movement is almost entirely outward with little or no genuine return inward, the psyche begins to operate on a kind of debt. You keep extending outward because the world keeps asking for it, and because stopping feels uncomfortable. But underneath the continued functioning, something is being depleted that the usual forms of rest do not replenish, because it is not the body that is depleted. It is the self, and the self is replenished not by lying down or by switching to a different form of stimulation, but by genuine interiority, by time spent in the interior space with nothing asked of you by the world, nothing to perform, nothing to respond to, nothing to produce, just the quiet experience of being in your own presence. This is what staying home, in the deepest sense of that phrase, makes possible. Not simply the absence of social obligation, but the presence of something that cannot exist in the absence of interior quiet. The chance to hear what is actually happening inside you. To notice what you actually feel, beyond what you are performing or producing or managing for the world's benefit. To be surprised by your own thoughts when they are not shaped by the demands of context. To encounter yourself as you actually are, rather than as you have been required to be. A woman once described to me the experience of spending an entire weekend at home after a year of extraordinary professional intensity. She had expected to feel restless. She had prepared herself for the guilt of not being productive. What she had not expected was the sensation, somewhere around the second afternoon, of recognizing herself, of feeling, almost physically, the return of something she had not realized was missing, a quality of inner presence, a sense of being inhabited by herself rather than constantly reaching outward to manage a world that had come to feel too large and too demanding. Jung would not have been surprised by this. He would have said that what she experienced was the psyche's natural response to the restoration of the inward movement. The self, which had been crowded out by the relentless extroversion of the preceding months, beginning to reassert its presence in the interior space that had been finally cleared for it. Number 3. Solitude and the difference between loneliness and being with yourself. One of the most important distinctions in Jung's entire understanding of the psychological life is the distinction between loneliness and genuine solitude. Because they can look identical from the outside and can even feel similar in their early stages, but they are profoundly different psychological states with profoundly different effects on the inner life. Loneliness, for Jung, is the experience of being cut off from connection. It is the pain of genuine isolation, of having no one who knows you or cares about you, of existing in a world that does not register your presence. Loneliness is a form of poverty, a deprivation of something the psyche genuinely needs, and Jung never romanticized it or pretended it was anything other than painful and real. Genuine solitude, by contrast, is something entirely different. It is the experience of being with yourself, of being in your own company and finding that company sufficient, of discovering in the interior quiet, not the absence of connection, but the presence of the most fundamental connection available to a human being, the connection to your own self. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. You can be surrounded by people and be profoundly lonely. You can be entirely alone and be profoundly not lonely, because you are in genuine contact with the most real thing there is, which is the reality of your own inner life. Staying home creates the conditions for genuine solitude. Not always immediately, and not automatically. Many people stay home and find themselves doing everything possible to avoid being actually alone with themselves. They fill the silence with noise, the stillness with activity, the interior space with the virtual presence of the digital world. They are physically at home, but psychologically still in constant outward extension, still performing and responding and filling every quiet moment before it can become truly quiet. Genuine solitude requires something more intentional than merely being at home. It requires the willingness to let the silence be actually silent, to let the stillness be actually still, to resist the habitual reach for the next distraction and instead allow the interior space to open, with all the discomfort that brings in the early moments before the self begins to settle, and the deeper layers of experience begin to become audible. Jung was honest about the fact that this initial discomfort is real. The first silence is often uncomfortable because it is in the silence that everything you have been outrunning begins to catch up. The questions you have been too busy to ask, the feelings you have been too engaged to fully feel, the aspects of your own experience that have been waiting patiently at the edge of consciousness for a moment, when you are not so occupied that you can simply walk past them again. When you finally stop, they are there, and meeting them is not always comfortable, but Jung believed, with great conviction and on the basis of both clinical evidence and personal experience, that meeting them is always worth it, that the things waiting in the interior quiet are not, in the end, as threatening as the part of you that avoids them imagines them to be, that the self, encountered honestly in genuine solitude, is not the chaotic and overwhelming thing that the fear of silence suggests. It is the most reliable guide available, the most honest source of orientation, the most trustworthy compass for the questions of how to live that no external authority can answer on your behalf. Number 4. The home as the laboratory of the self. Jung's psychology is, in the deepest sense, a psychology of becoming. Its central conviction is that the human being is always in process, always moving, whether consciously or unconsciously, toward a more complete expression of what they potentially are. The individuation process, which is Jung's name for this movement, does not happen primarily in dramatic events or in the encounters with the great challenges of a life. It happens in the ordinary, in the daily, in the apparently unremarkable space of a life being lived with attention. The home is, more than any other environment, the space where this ordinary life happens. It is the space of the unperformed, the space where you are not required to be the professional or the friend or the social participant, or the competent person managing the demands of a world that does not know or care about your inner life. At home, the performance ends, or it can, if you allow it to. The question of who you are when no one is watching, when nothing is required of you, when there is no role to play and no impression to manage, is answered continuously, in the daily life of the home. This is why the quality of your interior life at home tells you something that the quality of your professional or social life cannot. In those external environments, you can be supported by structure, role, expectation, and the energy of other people to be more than you are alone. The home strips that away. What remains when the structure and the roles and the external energy are removed is what you actually are. And this is not a cause for anxiety. It is the most valuable information available. Jung spoke of what he called active imagination, one of the central practices he developed for engaging consciously with the unconscious. It requires, above all things, the conditions of interior quiet, a willingness to sit with oneself without agenda, without the pressure of what needs to be done or what should be thought, or what would be the appropriate response, and simply to notice what arises, what images appear, what feelings surface, what voices speak in the inner quiet that are never heard in the outer noise. This practice is most naturally available in the home. Not because the home is a therapeutic setting or a place of special psychological significance, but because it is simply the place most removed from the constant external demands that prevent interior attention. The kitchen where you make something with your hands without needing to explain the process to anyone. The window where you sit and watch the quality of afternoon light change without needing to describe it or share it or make it meaningful for anyone but yourself. The room where you can be genuinely still, genuinely quiet, genuinely alone with whatever is actually happening inside you, without the relentless pressure to be somewhere else, or to be someone else, or to make something visible and shareable and socially legible out of your interior experience. These are not wasted hours. They are not signs of a life being poorly lived. They are, in Jung's understanding, the hours when the self is most actively at work on the process of becoming, the hours when the integration that cannot happen in the noise and the performance of the external world is quietly taking place in the interior quiet of genuine solitude. Number 5. What is built in stillness that cannot be built in motion? There is a particular kind of knowledge that cannot be acquired in movement. It can only be acquired in stillness. Not intellectual knowledge, not the kind of knowledge that can be communicated in books or lectures or podcasts, but the kind of knowledge that Jung called, in the depth sense, the knowledge of what you actually are, what you actually value, what actually matters to you beyond the immediate pressure of what the world is asking you to be or do or produce in any given moment. This knowledge does not arrive announced. It does not produce a clear moment of revelation that you can point to and say, "That is when I understood." It accumulates, slowly and almost imperceptibly, through the repeated practice of being genuinely still, of allowing the interior space to be what it is, rather than immediately filling it with the next thing, of sitting with a question rather than reaching for the first available answer, of letting the feelings be fully felt rather than managed into an acceptable shape for external presentation. A man I know spent the better part of 5 years moving very fast. A demanding career, a full social life, an almost continuous stream of travel and engagement and external stimulation. He was not unhappy by the conventional measures. He was respected, he was productive, he had built a life that looked, from the outside, like success. But somewhere in the 5th year something began to feel wrong in a way he could not precisely locate. Not a crisis, not a breakdown, just a growing sense that he did not quite know anymore what he thought about anything that was not immediately related to what he was required to produce. He spent a long weekend at home alone, not by design but because circumstances required it. He had planned to use the time productively. Instead, he found himself sitting for long periods doing very little, not meditating in any formal sense, just sitting, being with the quiet, and in that quiet very slowly something began to return. Not new knowledge, old knowledge, things he had known and had not thought about in years, preferences, values, qualities of experience that had been present before the speed had taken over and had simply been crowded out by it. By the end of the weekend he felt, in his own words, like he had been reintroduced to himself. Jung would have recognized this experience precisely. He would have said that what the man had encountered was not new but recovered, that the stillness had not created anything that was not already there. It had simply allowed what was already there to become audible again, in the way that a still lake allows you to see what the stirred surface had obscured. The self was present all along. The stillness simply made it perceptible again. Number 6. The world cannot give you what home can. There is something the world is very good at giving you. Stimulation, feedback, the sense of participation in something larger than yourself, the validation of being seen and recognized, the energy that comes from being in the presence of other people and their particular forms of aliveness. These are real things. They are genuinely nourishing in their own way. Jung never suggested that the outer world was without value or that the engagement with others was a distraction from what really mattered. The world matters. People matter. The life of the collective matters. But the world is not good at giving you yourself. This is the one thing it cannot offer, no matter how richly and generously you engage with it. The self is not found in the world's reaction to you. It is not located in the recognition others offer or in the roles the social world assigns. It is found only in the interior encounter with your own deepest reality. And that encounter requires conditions that the world, by its very nature, cannot provide. It requires the quiet, the stillness, the removal of external demand, the reduction of the noise to a level at which the interior voice can finally be heard. This is why staying home is not the same as missing out. It is not the same as being left behind. It is not a smaller or lesser version of the life that is happening elsewhere. It is a different dimension of life entirely, a dimension that is always available, always present, always waiting, but that can only be entered through the door of interior quiet. And that door is most often found, most reliably reached, in the simple and undervalued act of staying home. Jung lived his most important creative years in a rhythm that very deliberately included long periods of what the world might have called inactivity. Time at Bollingen, time in his garden, time in the simple physical work of building and tending and being present to what was immediately around him without the mediation of professional performance or social role. From these periods came some of the deepest and most enduring ideas of his entire body of work, not despite the stillness, because of it. Not in spite of the apparent unproductivity, through it. Number 7. Choosing home as an act of psychological courage. There is something that needs to be said directly about what it costs, in the current cultural moment, to genuinely choose home. Not as a consolation for having nowhere else to be, not as the path of least resistance on a day when the effort required to go out feels too great, but as a genuine, considered, conscious choice made in full awareness of the alternatives, a choice that says, I know what is out there, and I am choosing this instead. I am choosing the interior over the exterior, the quiet over the noise, the return to myself over the continuation of my outward movement. This is an act of psychological courage, not because staying home is physically difficult, or because it requires the kind of bravery that dramatic action requires, but because it requires the willingness to resist a very powerful and very pervasive cultural pressure, the pressure to be visible, to be engaged, to be present in the world in the ways the world most readily registers and rewards presence, to be productive in the ways that produce legible, shareable, socially recognizable output, to be moving, always moving, because stillness looks too much like stopping, and stopping looks too much like giving up or falling behind or not being quite enough. Jung understood this pressure clearly. He experienced it in his own life, in the social and professional world of early 20th century Europe, which had its own version of the relentless demand for outward engagement. And he consistently, across the decades of his mature life, chose not to be entirely governed by it. He chose the Bollingen Tower. He chose the periods of interior withdrawal. He chose the long hours of writing that no one would see for years, the conversations with himself in the silence of his own study, the attention to his dreams and his interior life that the professional world around him often found puzzling or excessive. He chose these things not because they were comfortable or because they were socially rewarded, but because he understood something that the world of his time, like the world of our time, found it very easy to forget. That the outer life is only as rich as the inner life that supports it. That the capacity to be genuinely present to others requires the practice of being genuinely present to yourself. That the quality of what you bring to the world depends entirely on the quality of what you are cultivating in the interior space that no one else can enter for you. Staying home, chosen consciously and inhabited genuinely, is how you cultivate that interior space, It is how you return to yourself after the extended outward movements that a life in the world requires. It is how you maintain the thread of your own experience across the days and weeks and years that would otherwise blur into an undifferentiated stream of stimulation and response and managed performance. It is how you know, at the end of a long season of engagement with everything the world asks of you, that you have not lost yourself in it, that you are still there, still present, still genuinely inhabiting the life that is yours to live. If this video touches something in you that you have been trying to name without quite being able to find the right words, something about the value of quiet and the necessity of return, and the strange courage that staying home can require, then perhaps it is not accidental that you are watching it now. Leave a word in the comments about what staying home means for you, because the things we tend to undervalue are often exactly the things that are quietly sustaining everything else. And if you want to continue exploring what the inner life requires and what it makes possible, stay close to this channel. Not to become a different version of yourself for the world's benefit, but to come back to the one that was always here, waiting, in the quiet of your own home, for you to finally fully return. There is one more dimension of this that is worth exploring with some honesty, because it touches something that many people feel but rarely allow themselves to say out loud. There is a particular kind of person who has always known, somewhere beneath the social performance they have learned to sustain, that they are most alive when they are alone, not because they dislike people or because they are incapable of genuine connection, but because their inner life is simply so active, so genuinely rich with its own content and its own processes, that it requires more interior time than the social world typically allocates or understands. Jung called this the introverted attitude, and he was careful to explain that introversion in his sense of the word has nothing to do with shyness or social anxiety, or the inability to function in the company of others. It is an orientation of psychic energy, a tendency for the psyche's energy to flow primarily inward rather than primarily outward. The introverted person is nourished, in the deepest sense, by interior experience, by thought, by feeling, by the encounter with the symbolic and the imaginal dimensions of experience that only become accessible when the outer world has quieted enough to allow the inner world to speak. For this kind of person, staying home is not a retreat. It is a return. It is the movement back to the conditions in which they are most fundamentally themselves, and yet the culture they live in will very often tell them, in ways both explicit and implicit, that this natural movement inward is a problem to be solved, that the preference for interior quiet is a deficiency to be compensated for, that the hours spent at home, not producing anything visible, not engaging with anything the world can measure, not being present in the ways the social world recognizes as presence, are hours being wasted. Jung would have recognized this pressure as the collective's way of demanding that the individual conform to a standard that was not designed for everyone. The extroverted ideal, the assumption that the most fully alive and most fully functional human being is the one most continuously and enthusiastically engaged with the outer world, is not a neutral description of human nature. It is a cultural preference, and it extracts a very real cost from the people whose nature it does not match. The cost is not merely discomfort. It is the gradual erosion of the interior life that the introverted person's psyche most requires for its health and its development. When that interior life is consistently starved of the time and the quiet it needs, when the pressure to be outward and visible and continuously engaged overrides the natural rhythm of inward return, the result is not simply tiredness. It is the particular form of alienation that Jung described as the loss of the self, the experience of performing a version of yourself continuously without ever having the space to know who that self actually is. Beneath the performance, staying home is the remedy for this. Not permanently, not to the exclusion of the outer life that is also real and also necessary, but consistently, regularly, as a non-negotiable part of the rhythm of a life that takes the inner life seriously, as the counterweight to all the outward extension that a life in the world requires, as the space where the self is not merely maintained but actually developed, deepened, allowed to become more fully what it is capable of being. Jung wrote, in a reflection late in his life, that the most important question a person can ask themselves is whether they are related to the infinite or not. He did not mean this in a religious sense, or not only in a religious sense. He meant it in the psychological sense of whether a person has access to the deepest layers of their own experience. Whether they have developed a relationship with the dimensions of the inner life that extend beyond the personal, beyond the biographical, beyond the ego's immediate concerns and immediate history. Whether they have, in the quiet of genuine solitude, touched something in themselves that is larger than the social role they have been playing. This access is not available in constant outward movement. It opens only in stillness. It speaks only in quiet. It requires the conditions that staying home, genuinely and consciously and without apology, most readily provides. And the person who has learned to create those conditions, who has developed the willingness to return to their own interior space, and to remain there long enough for the deeper layers to become audible, is not living a smaller life than the person who is always out in the world. They are living a larger one. Larger in the dimension that matters most, which is not the dimension of visibility or social engagement or the accumulation of external experience, but the dimension of genuine interior depth, of actually knowing who they are, of actually living from the inside the life that is most essentially their own. And this is what staying home, understood in the full and serious sense that Jung's psychology offers, makes possible. Not the avoidance of life, the living of it. More honestly, more deeply, more fully aligned with what is most real in the person doing the living, which is, in the end, the only way any of us ever truly lives at all. It is also worth saying something about what the home becomes, over time, for the person who learns to use it in this way. Because it does not stay the same. The home that is merely a place to sleep and store things and recover enough energy to go back out into the world is a very different place from the home that has become a genuine interior space, a place of active psychological life, a space that is saturated with the presence of the person who has been genuinely inhabiting it. Jung observed that the outer environment responds to the inner life in ways that are not always immediately legible, but are nonetheless real. When you begin to take your own interior life seriously, when you begin to create genuine conditions for solitude and for the kind of attention that solitude allows, the physical space you inhabit begins to reflect that shift. You begin to arrange it differently, to care for it differently, to choose what belongs in it with more discernment. Not because aesthetics suddenly matter more, but because the home has become the physical expression of what is happening inside you. And what is happening inside you has become worth expressing. This is not a small thing. The home that is genuinely inhabited, in the interior sense of that word, is one of the most powerful environments available to the process of individuation. Every object in it chosen with some degree of consciousness. Every arrangement reflecting something about the inner life of the person who lives there. Every room capable of holding a quality of psychological presence that is very different from the thin and impersonal quality of spaces that are merely functional. Jung himself wrote about the importance of what he called the personal environment, the immediate physical world that surrounds us in daily life. He believed that the degree of care and consciousness we bring to our immediate environment reflects and reinforces the degree of care and consciousness we bring to our inner life. The person who lives carelessly in their external environment tends also to live carelessly in their internal one. The person who takes their home seriously, who tends it as they tend their inner life, is building something in both spaces simultaneously, a quality of presence, a depth of inhabitation, a home that is not merely occupied but genuinely lived in the fullest psychological sense of those words. All of this begins with the simple act of choosing to be there, of staying home not as a default when nothing better is available, but as a positive and considered choice. A choice that says this space, this quiet, this interior encounter with myself is what I am choosing because it is what I most need and what the rest of my life depends upon. A choice that the world will not always understand or validate, but that the inner life will recognize immediately as the return it has been waiting for. The quality of your outer life, in the end, is determined by the quality of your inner life. And the quality of your inner life is determined, in large part, by the quality of the attention you are willing to give it. Staying home, genuinely and consciously and without apology or guilt, is one of the most direct and most reliable ways of giving it that attention. Jung understood this. He built his life around this understanding, and the extraordinary depth of what he was able to contribute to the world, across the decades of his long and intensely productive life, was not despite the time he spent in interior quiet. It was because of it, entirely unmistakably, irreversibly because of it.